Good evening. I'm Luke Bronin, Mayor of the City of Hartford, and so grateful for the chance to be with you tonight for this year's Stowe Prize ceremony. And I want to start by saying thank you to the entire team at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. The Stowe Center is a vital institution in our city, and it celebrates not just Hartford's central role in the intellectual life of our nation, but it also celebrates and highlights the power of words and writings and discourse and literature on shaping the arc of American history. So I'm so grateful to the team for everything they've done during this difficult year and everything they are doing now. I'm also incredibly grateful for the chance to join you to honor this year's awardee, Dr. Eddie Glaude. If we were just celebrating Dr. Glaude as an academic, as a scholar, we'd have a great deal to celebrate. But a central theme of Dr. Glaude's work, much like James Baldwin's, is the idea that sharing, uncensored sharing, often of our deepest, most provocative thoughts, is central to building understanding between each other, to self-exploration, but also to exploring ourselves as a community. And that is not just vital to liberal education, but also to democracy. And that is a central theme of Dr. Glaude's work, and it's a theme that we as a nation need to embrace now more than ever. It's important as we work to build relationships across differences. So, Dr. Glaude, it's an honor to be with you. To the entire team at the Stowe Center, thank you. I wish that we could be together in person, but hopefully next year we will. And in the meantime, we come together virtually as a community to celebrate the Stowe Center, to celebrate the Stowe Center's mission, and to celebrate the work of a man who has contributed deeply to our discourse, not just in his academic work, but in his public speakings and in his involvement in the intellectual life of our nation today. Thank you all. Have a great night. Glad to be with you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Johnson, and I had the privilege of serving on the Board of Trustees of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center for 6 years, the last 2 as board chair. So the Stowe Center holds a very special place in my head and my heart. But it's in my role as the Hartford's Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer that I'm speaking to you today. The Hartford is proud to once again be the legacy presenting sponsor of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center's Stowe Prize. It is an honor for us to continue our support of the Stowe Center and its commitment to preserving and interpreting the life and work of Harriet Beecher Stowe and uphold her legacy of giving voice to social justice and positive change. The Stowe Prize recognizes the author of a distinguished book whose work illuminates a critical social issue. And with Begin Again, Dr. Eddie Glaude writes of a crossroad that many Americans experience, which is not unique to our time. Comparing our current struggles of race today with the civil rights movement during James Baldwin's time, Glaude talks of the hope and guidance that we can find from looking at our past and calling for a new future. It was Ralph Waldo Emerson who said, "The mind, once stretched by a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions." The Hartford believes that a critical element in advancing equity is for unique ideas and perspectives to be heard and courageously discussed. This is precisely why the Stowe Prize and tonight's conversation with Dr. Glaude is so important. It helps broaden and challenge our thinking and allows us to participate in a dialogue that accelerates progress. The Hartford is also steadfast in our commitment to the City of Hartford and the Asylum Hill neighborhood, where we are dedicated to advancing equitable access to economic, educational, and workforce opportunities for all its residents. Another great quote comes from Harriet Beecher Stowe herself, who stated, "Never give up, for that is just the place and time that the tide will turn." We are at that place and time now, and it is in the words of Dr. Eddie Glaude that we find inspiration to never give up. On behalf of the Hartford, we extend our most heartfelt congratulations to Dr. Glaude on this prestigious award.
I'd like to start by saying thank you. Thank you to all of you who are tuning in. Thank you for your spirit of giving and for your support of the Stowe Center. Stowe's mission would not be possible without the generosity of everyone near and far. We have an unparalleled partnership with our presenting sponsor, the Hartford, whose support has just been extraordinary. This is a community partner that walks the walk when it comes to issues of social justice, inclusion, and diversity, and we cannot imagine a more committed neighbor. Thank you to the Hartford. Special thanks to our silver sponsors, Beth Shiro and Stephen Baer, longtime friends of the Stowe Center. Brianne Greenfield and Catherine Kane, former Stowe executive directors, who teamed up so generously to support this year's event. Thank you. And to our newest sponsor, Stanley Black & Decker, we welcome you and we're grateful for your interest and your support. And thank you to the rest of our sponsors.
In addition to our sponsors, there are several individuals that we'd like to acknowledge for their commitment serving as hosts. They've coordinated groups of their friends and associates to join them in supporting this year's program. Thank you all. And thank you to our wonderful committees, our steering committee, our honorary committee, and our Stowe Prize selection committee. These individuals have lent their expertise, decision-making, and have served as brain trust, enabling us to bring you what promises to be an insightful, provocative, and meaningful conversation this evening. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Beth Burgess, Director of Collections and Research here at the Stowe Center, and Dr. Jeffrey O.G. Agbar. Dr. Agbar is Professor of History and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Popular Music at the University of Connecticut. He is the author and editor of several books, including Black Power, Radical Politics and African American Identity, and Hip Hop Revolution, The Culture and Politics of Rap. Dr. Agbar's articles appear in various academic journals. He has been invited to write for the New York Times, Room for Debate, and the Daily Beast, among other publications. Raised in Los Angeles, California, Dr. Agbar received his BA in history from Morehouse College and his MA and PhD degrees in history from Indiana State University. Jeffrey is also a Stowe Center board member serving his second term. Welcome, Beth and Jeffrey.
Welcome. Dr. Eddie Glaude, we're absolutely excited to have you here tonight. We have an extraordinary opportunity to engage this wonderful book of yours, the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. We're excited. Congratulations on this book prize. I'm personally elated. Of course, I've known you for many years now, well over half my life. And I can say in a brief introduction before I turn everything over to Beth that I was a fan of yours from at least 1989. So some people might be familiar with the famous Public Enemy song, Fight the Power, and it starts off 1989, the number. But, you know, in 1988, 1989, you were student government president at Morehouse College, and I was a sophomore there. And, you know, like most of us, we were very, very pleased with the person we elected in this office. And so, you know, thank you very much for being a leader, a mentor for many years. So we're very excited here. I want to turn things over to Beth for a brief introduction before we begin our program.
Sure, thanks, Jeff. My name is Beth Burgess. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the collections here at the Stowe Center. The Stowe Center holds the largest collection of materials related to the life and works of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which of course is the 19th century's best-selling, internationally famous anti-slavery novel, as well as 30 other books. Comprised of nearly 250,000 items, the Stowe Center's collections include print materials, rare manuscripts, graphics, photographs, as well as works of art and household furnishings. They are nationally important because of their understanding. We can understand through them the social impact of slavery, the historical and literary significance of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the continued legacy of racism in America. So tonight we're excited to show you some really rare items in our collection and how we can have this conversation around James Baldwin and Uncle Tom's Cabin and just race in our country.
So first, I wanted to sort of, provide the context here. So your book was released in 2020. Congratulations on having a New York Times bestseller in the summertime, which is a feat. And so, like many academics write wonderful books that are read by a wonderfully small audience. And to have this degree of impact, not just a book that is read by many people, but resonates with people. And it resonated in a year, in 2020, a year that it seemed that Baldwin's message had a particular weight. It had a particular resonance with all the things that we saw unfold in the summer of 2020. So your book comes out, and it, in many ways, as Baldwin, someone who rose to fame in the 1950s and 60s and, critiqued protest novels, and himself a novelist, but also an essayist of current events, someone who debated the institutions and the scaffolding of racial oppression, and he's talking about police brutality. He's talking about all the things that people are talking about in 2020. And so as people take to the streets across the United States and people are marching by the thousands, this message from Baldwin from 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, I mean, these messages sort of, they resonate, and your book comes out at this time, and it speaks to this moment in really fascinating ways. But what's important here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center is that 100 and some odd years before Baldwin, you have this New England white woman who writes this book, a protest novel, if you will, right? Talking about slavery, right? And this novel becomes not just sort of, the best-selling novel, something that the president and so many other people, said gives some sort of fire to the start of the Civil War, that Baldwin himself critiques Harriet Beecher Stowe, like years later, right? And although this novel that is clearly anti-slavery, not just anti-slavery, but an abolitionist novel, right? There's a distinction there. And so for Baldwin, I'm curious. So he wrote Everybody's Protest novel, an article in 1949, right, in Partisan Review. Mm-hmm. And then later he critiques, Richard Wright and Native Son, mm-hmm. and Notes on a Native Son, published in 1955. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of a novelist as a protest novel, not necessarily engaged in the same thing, but can you tell us a little bit about how James Baldwin fits into, one, this historical moment and why this resonated as much as it did, but also because one might argue that he's been very critical of protest novels, as many people might think that he was someone who wrote protest novels.
Right. Well, first of all, it's just such an honor to be in conversation with you after all of these years, and with you, Beth. I'm honored that the Stowe Center recognized the value of the work, and delighted that we're going to sit down and think together and talk together about the ideas that animate not only Baldwin's corpus, but the way in which I was trying to write with him. And when I found out about this, I thought it was ironic, precisely because of Everybody's Protest novel. Baldwin is relentless in his criticism of Stowe's novel. And he's relentless for a variety of reasons, right? But the first is that it drips with sentimentality. And Baldwin has this line, and I'm paraphrasing it. He has a line in the essay where he says, sentimentality is, in effect, a mask for cruelty. That what really motivates Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin isn't really the life circumstances of black people on the ground, these slaves, right? It's what he calls this kind of theological terror, this fear of the fires of hell. And what happens as a result is that the complexity of black life gets flattened. Right? So when you read what bothers him about the protest novel, generally, and specifically in this instance with Uncle Tom's Cabin, and even with Native Son, Richard Wright's magisterial novel, is that black life gets reduced to the tangled web of pathology, that the complexity of who we are, right, doesn't find its way on the page, and any novelist worth her salt, right, has to attend, right, to the complexity of their characters. Otherwise, you have this kind of flatland with these triangles and lines moving about the page, as it were. So the first critique is that it's sentimentality. The second critique is that the characters really don't, outside of her declaring them black, they don't map on to any character on the ground, and that's familiar to us. And when he links that critique of Uncle Tom's Cabin to the criticism of Bigger Thomas, right? He's like, but Richard, if we're all biggers, then we can't account for you. We can't account for the circumstances that produced you in Mississippi. We can't, think about the joys and the laughter and this is why I think Ellison and Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray initially thought Jimmy was in their camp politically, because he's trying to hold at two things at once, right? One, to keep track of the material conditions of black life, but two, keep track of the complexity of black interiority, right? Selves, right? Now, all of this is in the service of him trying to offer, I think, a very thick account of the horror of this place. The contradictions, the panic, the terror that's at the heart of the American enterprise. Right? The fact that generally the country wants to avoid, right, what's going on the inside. They tell themselves lies about who they are and what they are doing under the cover of night.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question.
Sure.
So Richard Wright was around to respond to James.
Yeah.
Baldwin. Harriet Beecher Stowe was not. Right?
Du Murgot, yeah, that famous argument in Paris, yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that. So we have this upstart, this guy from New York City who finds his way to Paris, and he finds Richard Wright. Richard Wright's a famous author at this point. And he's an African American living in Paris, and as cliche as it sounds, they circulate in different spaces, intellectualize, talk about things. I'm sure drink, wine.
Got a lot of liquor,
right? Mm-hmm. And then he writes this piece, and many people think of him as sort of disloyal, right? And so critique James Baldwin as a sort of someone who's trying to find a name for himself by taking down a lion in the field, right? And so, how does Richard Wright respond to this? This critique?
Richard Wright is hurt in a lot of ways, right? Because Baldwin's career is made possible, in some ways by Richard Wright. Gets him a Roosevelt Fund fellowship that allows him to at least try to figure out how to write Go Tell It on the Mountain in the first go around, right? Baldwin does. He says I had to leave. He said I had to leave the country in 1948 because either I was going to get killed or I was going to kill somebody. And he said I could have gone anywhere. Baldwin was lying. He knew why he went to Paris. There's an expat community there. Richard Wright was there. And when he comes into the restaurant, Richard Wright in that high-pitched voice, hey boy, come here. And when Richard Wright read the piece, he felt, this patricidal act, right? Like all of these folk seem to have done, right? Baldwin was a bit confused. At least this is how he reports it. He in effect took himself to be treating Richard Wright with the highest regard, to be able to figure out how to differentiate his own aesthetic from his right, from Wright's. And in a later piece, Alas, Poor Richard, and Nobody Knows My Name, he tries to return to this. And what's fascinating about that piece is that he predicts that he will find himself one day in the same position that Richard was in, vis-a-vis him. And of course that was true when you think about Eldridge Cleaver's response to James Baldwin, when you think about Vicious. So Baldwin actually writes in Alas, Poor Richard that he is inevitable that he will find himself in the same position. So.
On a side note, does he ever respond to Eldridge Cleaver's vicious attack?
And nobody knows. I mean, in No Name in the Street, he does. He does. But most folk don't know. If you look at that moment, Eldridge Cleaver has to. He's in exile. He has to leave the country. And if you look at the papers, the Black Panther Party papers, they're fundraising for those Panthers who are in exile, and the first name on every list is James Baldwin. He's donating money to make sure that it gets. But he responds to me. He said, in effect, it hurt, but Cleaver could never understand him. He knew why. Yeah.
So the next item that we're going to talk about, the next group of items, I should say, a collection of first-person memoirs or autobiographies by formerly enslaved people. And the Stowe Center's got an amazing collection, about 100 of these from 1839 to about 1860. So one of them is Narrative of a Colored Man by Reverend Noah Davis from 1859. So these are clearly memoirs filled with terror, turmoil, lived experiences. Certainly, we know that Stowe went to the Boston anti-slavery rooms to read copies like this. Certainly, Josiah Henson and Frederick Douglass and others. Anything she could get her hand on to really understand what it was like to be an enslaved person. So could you discuss a little bit about the inclination or understanding where this life starts in slavery and the connection to Baldwin and understanding racism in the U.S. from that period, from the pre-Civil War period?
These are really important, right?
Yeah.
Literally. In these narratives, in these memoirs, you have persons trying to write themselves into being. Right? These are these writerly selves. And oftentimes they're in the service of a particular political project, right?
Yeah.
To give voice to X, Y, and Z as abolitionists are making the case against slavery. And of course, we're not just talking about white abolitionists in this instance, right? But part of the way in which these memoirs or narratives are constructed, it's really oftentimes constructed with the white gaze in mind, aimed to convince them of the moral abomination that is slavery. And so some people will say that you can't get at the interiority of the slave. Remember Baldwin's complaint about Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's sentimentalized, right? The characters are flat. We don't really, because it's all in the service of a political project. And any novelist worth her salt has to, in some ways, deal with the complexity of human beings, have to deal with what freedom actually entails for those of us who are trying to make our way from womb to tomb. The narratives, the slave narratives, the memoirs, are kind of fit within that problematic and interesting sorts of ways. But when you read them closely, you see something, right? I mean, you could read not only this one, but say J.W.C. Pennington's The Fugitive Blacksmith. And there's a moment in that narrative where, his family, mother, father, brothers, sisters, he witnesses his father being brutally assaulted by the slave master. He's insulted by the slave master. He has to then decide to leave. Now, usually we focus on, the escape. But the decision to leave means that he leaves his family in peril. What will happen to them?
Right.
And so if you're reading it only to convince those who are complicit in their silence with the institution of slavery that they ought not to be, then you only see that part of the story, right? But if you're actually paying attention to the narratives and what they're revealing in their detail, you get a moment where Pennington expresses a deep sense of guilt about leaving, and he never gets over it.
Right.
It actually haunts the narrative if you track it. Now, I'll say this really quickly. I'm talking too much.
Yeah.
You should talk a lot.
Yeah.
Toni Morrison said that the slave narratives don't really offer us a sense of the interiority of Black life. Al Raboteau, the late American religious historian, disagreed with her vehemently on this. But Morrison writes Beloved, right, as an attempt to give us a sense of the complexity of the self that experiences this brutality. Yeah.
Right.
So what do you think of that, though? I mean, so Al Roboteau, rest in peace, just passed.
Yeah.
So we,
It's
a colleague of
dear
yours
friend,
at Princeton.
dear friend.
Yeah,
My teacher, yeah.
Wow. And so a huge loss and a giant in the field. but someone who is a scholar, of his caliber, of course, deeply engaged in this research about a long tradition of black religious expression and in different institutions before and after slavery and during. Think about Morrison, also a colleague of yours at Princeton, and someone who's, a literary giant. And so, which is beautiful about this disagreement is that people get a chance to see how, two people who are very committed to a common general cause can, have vehement disagreements on an issue, and their integrity can, not be questioned, right? But I'm curious about your opinion about the issue. I mean, think about these, like J.W.C. Pennington and Henry Box Brown, or some of these other folks who write these stories of escaping from slavery. Frederick Douglass, who writes, multiple autobiographies, right? So when you think about these slave narratives, do you agree that they fail to demonstrate the complexity and sort of delve into the complexity of those people who are enslaved? Do you think they're flat? Do you think they're solely for the white gaze? I mean, how do you see them as a corpus of work?
I tend to fall in the middle. They're both ends. So most of them do, in fact, have a political purpose, a political aim that drives their construction. At the same time, there are often attempts to kind of offer a story that gives the self a sense of coherence. Right? So to use Henry Louis Gates's language, these writerly texts, they're literally writing themselves into existence. I was so influenced by Al. My first book, Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation, comes out of an essay that he wrote about the ways in which the enslaved used the Exodus story to imagine themselves and to imagine a politics. And I always used to contrast these stories that that Al Raboteau would tell and Toni Morrison would tell. Toni Morrison tells the story that when she wrote the section around Paul D having the bit in his mouth, that she, in fact, had put a bit in her mouth as she was writing it. Al used to say that when he was writing Slave Religion, as one of those, because Al was a student of Sidney Ostrom at Yale, he said he remembers hearing the voices, right, of our ancestors in the house as he was writing. So both of them are trying to have this material, psychical, spiritual connection to the material that they're writing about, to the people that they're writing about. Both of them are working in those narratives. Right? Morrison trying to give voice to the silences. Raboteau finding archival sources. Well, let me be even more explicit, because he's, in effect, the founder of a field. Writes one of the cornerstone texts that helps create African American religious history as a subfield. Right? He has to find the documents that become the cornerstone of the field. So, but I think let me say this really quick, if you read these narratives, right, in the in-between spaces, and you don't read them as simply in the service of an abolitionist project, but you read them, you're going to find, right, all sorts of indications of the tragic soul life of people who have endured the unimaginable. You're going to see why Morrison created the phrase, unspeakable things unspoken. It's in those texts. Yeah.
One of the things that when Beth and I did a walkthrough of the archives here, and I think what's important for many of the people who are viewing this event to sort of be aware of, as she said, we have over 200,000 collections here, which is amazing, extraordinary, right? For historic a home, a house, and now this center, to have so many things. And so researchers have come in from all around. And we were going through ephemera, we were going through letters, first edition books from the 19th century, saying all sorts of amazing things. And there's a letter that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote to Frederick Douglass as she was doing research. So you said something that was really important about Morrison and Al Raboteau about how they engaged in research, right? And they were going to archives, they're reading what enslaved people actually said, right? I suspect, I don't know, but I know historians are listening to WPA and reading to WPA interviews from the 1930s of people who had been formerly enslaved. And so people take this task very seriously. And I'd imagine in the 19th century with a privileged white woman trying to write a novel and trying to have some validity, some verisimilitude, right? And so think about this and how she went about this process. And she took it upon herself to write this letter to the most famous black abolitionists in the country. And we have that in our collections here. The thing is, and Beth can speak to this, about if we know if Frederick Douglass ever responded. And if you want to add anything to this before
sure.
I ask my follow-up?
Yeah, the letter is July 9, 1851, so it's about a month into her writing Uncle Tom's Cabin as a serial. And she really wants, the argument is she really wants to understand a real experience of someone who's been a laborer on a cotton plantation, knowing that his narrative and having read it, that he had that experience. It's a pretty just aggressive letter for a white woman at the time to write, she'd never spoken to him before. So I want your information. Can you share this with me? Stowe's biography, Joan Hedrick, goes into this. So it's interesting. We don't have his response back, but we have later published editorials and things back and forth between them.
After her book becomes this world-famous book, like the best-selling novel of its generation. Right?
Specifically around colonization, because she closes Uncle Tom's Cabin around the idea of colonization. And his response, I'm paraphrasing, is, "We're here and we're not going anywhere." It would be curious. We know that they did meet at Stowe's house in the late 1850s afterwards. And so I think certainly the power in their connection is bringing the topic forward, enslavement, and the end of enslavement forward. But from all accounts, we're not exactly sure how tumultuous or untumultuous the relationship was.
If I'm not mistaken, Frederick Douglass at first didn't, in fact, appreciate the novel. Am I right? And so he thought this novel would be fascinating when you think about conversations over time. Like, if he and James Baldwin would have shared some criticism of this novel, right? And sort of thinking that this novel was problematic for all sorts of ways. Depictions of black people, how the institution of slavery, how the characters were sort of created.
Yep.
What are some other some
stereotypes? Racial stereotypes coming out of the minstrel tradition that she's appropriating there, as well as the stories you just spoke about, enslaved narrative stories. She's making the novel as truthful as she can, but at the same time, it's using the story of others to get there and not fully understanding the black lived experience. Frederick Douglass later in life, I think in discussions with W.E.B. Du Bois, right? He's going back and forth about defending Uncle Tom's Cabin in a way, because it did a lot for the anti-slavery movement. But it's fascinating to go back and forth a little bit.
So there's a lot to be said about a sort of authentic voice, and I want to take this back to Baldwin, because when we think about novelists and how novelists are, creating this fictionalized world and inhabiting this world with all sorts of people who themselves are very different, right? Who have different motives, different likes, different dislikes, different passions, strengths and weaknesses that are quite different. And you're animating this fictional world. And so this person sort of has to sort of imagine and then give such complexity. And so there's this question here about the extent to which someone like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who's so far removed from slavery herself, how she can access that world with any sort of authentic voice. But then one can ask that about all sorts of novelists, right, who are populating a world of protagonists, right, antagonists, and people who are in conflict with each other, who in many ways their characters are diametrically opposed. And so you think, is this a burden with every novelist? Like, can any novelist, is this something particularly special for Harriet Beecher Stowe to sort of animate a world of characters that are very different from her? You know, because it seems that one of the criticisms that, you know, here she is, this, you know, this white woman from New England who's not familiar with slavery, and then she goes to some archives, she writes a letter to some people, and then tries to sort of animate this world. But I mean, aren't novelists always engaged in the same process?
Yeah,
so is this an unfair critique of her?
Well, it all depends on how the critique is made, right? If the critique is made that, you know, by virtue of the fact that you are a white woman, you cannot access X, then that doesn't quite work, right? But if you are a novelist who are trying to write about a world and you fail at doing so, then that's, and you fail at the level of the craft, at the level of execution, at the level of craft, right, that the characters don't really work. When you think about, outside of the brutality of slavery, when you think about the other black characters that populate the novel, the one, you know, they're basically white, blackface characters, right? That's their depth, you know, I mean, we can go through a whole range of things. Sure. You know, they just don't, outside of her labeling them black, they don't correspond to anything that would approximate, you know, black life at the time. So she fails in that regard. She doesn't fail because she can't access it. She fails and this is what I think Baldwin is saying, she fails because it's all in the service of the political aim of the novel. She's not actually interested in the characters that she's created. This is what she's saying, he seems to suggest. And some people will say Baldwin's characters, his novels, some of his characters become mouthpieces for him in some ways. So I don't believe that in certain, I think he's a much more accomplished essayist than he is a novelist, but that's me. That's not me trying to diminish his work as a novel writer. It's just what I'm most attracted to. But it seems to me, though, that when we read this letter, you know, there's a kind of anthropological gaze, right? Tell me this, right? There's not a real attempt to, because how can I put it? We are objects of concern as opposed to human beings experiencing or catching hell. And usually when that happens, when black folk, and Baldwin understood this, when black folk are seen as objects of concern, the recipients of philanthropic concern or gestures, the objects of charity, then the logic of white supremacy still obtains. Because if racial justice is thought of within the frame, a philanthropic frame or charitable frame, then somebody believes that they possess racial equality in order to give it to somebody else. And then the question is, who are you to believe that you possess equality to give to me? You see, and you can see that element, and that, and I should say this really quickly, that would lead to someone like Walt Whitman, who's anti-slavery. But when you read,
racist.
But oh my God, he doesn't think these black folk have the capacities to be citizens at all.
And Frederick Douglass was the thing is, like, the historical figure we know of Frederick Douglass was very well aware of that sort of paternalistic gaze. And so I suspect, and I never read this closely, when he got this letter, he probably was like,
what the hell is this?
Exactly. I got other things to do. You know, and who's this random person demanding, like you said, Beth, aggressively, sort of demanding that he take a whole bit of time.
The most photographed man in the United States.
I mean, but he was very well aware of all these things. And he was
in 1851, by the way, when all hell is breaking loose because of the fugitive slave law and what's going on around the country.
In many ways, this is increasing his militancy, right? I mean, you know, he's becoming more frustrated with the United States. He's becoming more frustrated with the North, with the sort of weak-kneed, pliant, always compromising, you know, elements of the North with the slave power of the South. And so at this point, you know, I suspect that he may have seen this letter. He has other things going on and probably balled it up and threw it in the trash rather than even think to sort of, you know, engage it in that level.
I imagine that. That's the stuff of a play.
Yes. It would be wonderful to see the play.
Response to Harriet Beecher Stowe's
We have other documents that we like to walk through because we do have, and some of these actually resonate with what you mentioned about minstrel images. And so if we go forward with some of the files, we'll see these here.
Yeah, I think the first one we're going to show is Uncle Tom's Cabin sheet music. And this is a British souvenir piece that came out of a theater production. So, you know, like you go to see Broadway's show today, you can buy a playbill or any kind of souvenir hat, whatever. This is a sheet music, so you could take home and play it on your piano. So what it's showing, circa 1878, sorry, is racial stereotypes, especially in Topsy, in the upper left corner there, and in, I think it was Uncle Tom and Little Eva. And even by 1878, Uncle Tom looks a lot different than the strong young father that Stowe wrote him as. So it's fascinating to see how the changes, the minstrel adaptation has taken over Uncle Tom's Cabin, and certainly this is 25 years later. And the performative aspect of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I know, Jeff, this is pop culture is your bag, so I won't steal it, but this is just one of, like, I think literally 1,200 items in the Stowe Center's collection that speak to Uncle Tom's Cabin on the stage and film.
So most recently, in terms of, you know, current events, Nicki Minaj, as you know, called a colleague of yours, I guess, in some way. I don't know if Joy Reid, I know at MSNBC.
Uncle Thomasina.
Yeah, right. And Uncle Tommy, because we usually, she said Uncle Tommyina, although it's usually Uncle Thomasina, she did some other thing. Because Joy Reid reminded her that she has incredible influence with 22 million followers on Twitter, and for her to say something as irresponsible as my cousin in Trinidad had a friend that took the vaccine and something horrible happens to genitalia, something that's completely unscientific, unverified, and the Trinidadian government had to come in and dismiss this foolishness. But she got angry, but she used this term that, of course, is derived from Harriet Beecher, and that after well over 150, 60 years, this term still resonates. But it means something different than what Stowe intended in the character, Uncle Tom, right? And so that Uncle Tom has been, as Beth said, even within a generation of the novel, as plays went out, that the minstrel, and to go back to what you said, the minstrel had become, and was already before, as the novel came out, is already established, but the minstrel was such a dominant expression of how people understood blackness in pop culture. That, and for students who now look at pop culture, the only space in which I would argue that sort of anti-black images dominate, right, that they're normative in pop culture would be commercial hip hop, where it's sort of, you know, everything, all the sort of tropes of sort of like anti-blackness are sort of there in this character, in the sort of commercial field. But to go back to like the 19th century and thinking about why there's this sort of, this morphing into these, the emphasis on these crude, coarse, minstrel figures, what do you think was going on here, the first generation after this novel, and how plays and how America sort of gravitated to these depictions? As you were saying before, the problematic images of how novels are written with black folk, very inauthentic expressions, and something that's ostensibly sympathetic to black people's interests. But then you have these minstrel shows that come out based on Uncle Tom's Cabin. And how do you reconcile something that's ostensibly for black people, but it's so explicitly anti-black?
Yeah.
Right, I think it's the consolidation of, or the beginning of the consolidation of a certain set of meanings around black bodies that will define the landscape, right? So 1878 is the year, I mean, this is a year after the Compromise of 1877, which announces the end of this radical experiment in multiracial democracy, right? Think of what follows from this, right? This moment ushers in, right, not just simply political terror, right, as the lost cause reasserts itself, right? As Tennessee and Mississippi will eventually pass the first Jim Crow laws, as convict leasing will begin to sweep the country as another form of slavery, which will lead to places like Birmingham being built on the backs of conscripted black labor through law enforcement. It's also this period in which not only tenant farming and sharecropping, right? In other words, you get another form of slavery that's taken shape. And and of course the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism is about to take off as well near the end of the 19th century as well. So this, from 1877 to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1898, there's a consolidation of racial meanings around black bodies that solidifies white supremacy. And it is circulating in popular culture, right? From assumptions about black people's work ethic, black people's sexual prowess, black people's moral standing. All of this is circulating in order to justify, in interesting sorts of ways, not to cause, but to justify the consolidation of a racial regime that will not be dismantled legally until Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. Right, this is all taking place. What's so fascinating about Uncle Tom's Cabin at the center of this, it shows us the relationship between, right, a certain kind of anti-abolitionist rhetoric that still carries within it the undertow of anti-black sentiment.
Walt Whitman.
Exactly. Or you read David Blight's wonderful book, Race and Reunion. Right. And what do you see in that text, right? In order for there to be a reconciliation between the North and the South, there has to be an erasure of the presence of these black folk. They have to be reduced, right? They have to be, reduced is not the right verb. They have to be made subordinate once again and invisible in that subordination.
Yeah, so the reunion centers around a white nationalist renaissance of sorts.
Right. And these images are critical features of that work. It gives white supremacy its commonsensical register.
We have another image, which is actually goes up to your point. Think about Brown versus Board in 1954. So, from 1877, you have Plessy versus Ferguson, go all the way up to 1954. And let's look at this next slide if we can. This Dennison's Makeup Guide from 1938. And please.
Yeah, so this is a promotional booklet that was marketed to actors, theater professionals, and it's not only showing you, as you can see, how to put on blackface makeup, but also other ethnic, racial, stereotypical, costuming. So not only does it market its own makeup, wigs, costume, the full thing in 1938, but how to be these horrifying tropes. And you see right out of this one called The Old Darky Servant is Uncle Tom. It's built on Uncle Tom as he would have looked at that time, very old, dour. He's got his head down, even in the photograph. So Uncle Tom has become and continues to be, still this interesting this character who is who culture feels him to be at the time, and I think that's what's so fascinating about the legacy that is.
And the brilliance of Jimmy Baldwin for me is his relentless deconstruction of those images. Not so much to declare them as racist, that's too easy, right? But to say, what is this saying about this place? Baldwin has this very provocative formulation, and I'm paraphrasing him here. He says, I've never been the N-word. I never thought of myself as the N-word. The question is, why did you invent the N-word? Right? Why do you need it? And until you answer that question, I'm going to give it back to you. Who's the real N-word here? Right? So part of what does it mean to inhabit the black face? What does it mean? Because that is not that is a mirror. That has nothing to do with me. Yeah. These stereotypes have nothing to do with me. It's what you need, you see. And it just so happens that I have to live under the burden of them. I have to live the consequence of it. I have to raise my children in it, right? As he says in the Uses of the Blues, he says, whatever the Negro problem is, it is that problem where we have to raise our children to not believe what this world says about them, so that they don't come to an understanding of themselves that reflects, right, the devaluation of the world, right, that they don't despise themselves, right? How do we in those images, that circulation of those, that we allow our children to move through these spaces, right, so that we understand that isn't about us.
Mm. Right. Which is like a perfect segue for our last image here. And when you think about the very last image, this image speaks directly to children, right? And it's not just about, Black children not seeing themselves from the gaze of, a hostile, sort of oppressive position, but also internalizing some of these images and having other people look at Black children saying this is an authentic expression of Blackness, even under these circumstances, that you might not be allowed to vote, not be allowed to go to school, not be allowed to get health care, not be allowed to get justice, not be allowed to have running water, not be allowed to do anything, right? But at the end of the day, they're happy. Look at them, right? These grinning, smiling little kids. And so at the end of the day, there was something about images that we find. As Beth and I went through the archive, we saw these different images. As you know, there were postcards about Black children being eaten by alligators. These were supposed to be funny, right? That there's no concern about Black suffering because, and even under these circumstances, Black children were happy, right? They had a sort of a perseverance, a sort of joy, and they were so simplistic that that conditions that otherwise affect a healthy human being did not affect them in the same way. Like white people wouldn't have been as happy and joyful, but these Negroes love to laugh. They were very, very happy, joyful people. But it's something from childhood all the way up. As in many ways, we think about the minstrel, these sort of coon figures, seven-fetching of others who were childlike, and it sort of speaks to their enduring childlike tendencies. And I want to know if you had something more to say about some of these pictures, but it goes again to this sort of enduring need to depict Blackness in a certain way, right? Whether we're talking about novels written by Black or non-Black people, but going all the way up to movies, postcards, the sort of ephemera that circulated. And
so this group of, I think it was about 12 photographs. They're souvenir photographs produced during the height of Jim Crow era. So this one was particularly dated 1895 by someone in Atlanta, Georgia. So souvenirs, so presumably purchased by white people on vacation, just traveling. It's a whole series, and in the back of these photograph postcards, it'll say out, such and such alligator breakfast, or really racist pieces collected by the Stowe Center in the 60s, really to provide an understanding of that era. But when I started doing a little research online, Library of Congress, I mean, they were so massive. The height of this, that the racial innocence that you spoke about in these photographs, understanding the devaluation of Black children, was so important to understanding white supremacy and one's self as a white person at the time. We're really right now understanding these images in a different way as part of our collections digitization project, and how to decolonize the archives is in the field something that we're looking at, getting other voices, other perspectives, decentering the whiteness from these objects. Also understanding that as awful as these objects are, they are in a way historic evidence of Black lived experience. So how do we put both of those things out? How do we talk about this to the general public as part of our ongoing conversation around this project?
When I was writing Begin Again, I was constantly trying to figure out how to write with Baldwin, not just about him, how to reflect on our own time in light of the insight of his corpus, right, provided by his corpus. And I was just sitting here thinking, drawing a straight line from those images to Tamir Rice. Right?
12-year-old.
Who was thought to be 21. So how innocence can be ascribed in this instance, and danger ascribed in a blink of an eye, in less than 3 seconds. Both are connected because the humanity of the baby is not acknowledged, it's not seen, right? Yeah. That there's a kind of devaluation at the core of it all. And, you know, and Baldwin is trying to say something here, and this is evidence, and this is what makes the book so fascinating for me, that it resonated, because I'm writing about the late Baldwin. I'm writing with the late Baldwin. This is the Baldwin that people thought was angry. His anger had overwhelmed his aesthetic. This is the Baldwin that people thought had become, you know, too comfortable in his celebrity and was too smitten by protest, as it were. But there's this sense that we have to confront that evidence, because that is the evidence of the monstrous nature of this place. What the Stowe Center has in its archive, right, are not only material objects and letters and the like, but it's evidence, right, of what we have done, what we continue to do, and what we refuse to face. Right. And we need those laughing children. We do. Because it protects our innocence, which allows us to continue to do what we do.
Mm. So we think about Begin Again, and you mentioned how you're writing with Baldwin, so you're thinking about Baldwin, and when you were quoting him, I couldn't help but almost like hear the intonations of Baldwin coming through you, right? And I think about how much of a challenge that might be. Did you ever imagine, as you wrote about Baldwin, like would Baldwin, how he might respond to the land? Because many people will say, oh, you know, things are the same. And, you know, things aren't the same, but there are still problems that Baldwin also confronted. But you'd imagine what Baldwin would say about the social political landscape of the United States, where, you know, black people are in parity in terms of Congress, right? I mean, this is something that Baldwin never, you know, let alone presidents and senators and things like that, mayors of all these cities. And so in many ways, there's all this change that he might think would be good, but he also sees George Floyd and Tamir Rice and all these other things. Did you, as you wrote about him and wrote with him, like how did you engage sort of extrapolating about Baldwin and how he would see the world?
Well, first thing I tried to do is to resist trying to anticipate what he would say about our moment. Mm-hmm. I wanted to write with him. Yeah. Not
explain why you didn't.
Yeah, because, you know, there's over 7,000 pages of writing. You know, we could figure out what he would think or how he would say. That wasn't my task. My task was to write with him, right? I remember hearing his voice saying to me, oh, if we're going to do this together, old boy, you're going to have to deal with you. You're going to have to deal with you. You're going to have to deal with you, right? And so for me, right, in this moment, right now, right here, we're catching up to him. We're finally hearing his voice, right? And so part of my task was to kind of bring to bear what I've learned by walking through his ruins, bring it to bear on our current moment. But there's so much more to say, but we don't have the time.
Elegantly written, exquisite. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.
I appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate you.
Well, we're absolutely excited. We had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Glaude. We will switch over to Joanna Beeman, who will carry us on in our program.
Wow, what an amazing discussion this evening. Thank you, Jeffrey, Dr. Glaude, and Beth for this insightful look into the collections of the Stowe Center as well as James Baldwin's work. I am just so happy to be here, and we are so lucky to have this historic collection and center where we can have these discussions. And I hope that you'll join me in supporting the Stowe Center so that we can continue to create programming such as this. You can join and support the Stowe Center by either using the Text to Give platform or by linking onto the Stowe Center donation link, both of which are on your screen right now. And now I'd like to turn it over to Joan Hedrick for our 2021 Stowe Prize presentation.
It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eddie S. Glaude, Jr., Professor of History at Princeton University and this year's winner of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Prize. Some of you may know him as a frequent political commentator on MSNBC. He is a public intellectual in the best tradition of W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, and in our time, Michelle Alexander, Brian Stevenson, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, 3 previous winners of the Stowe Prize. Like these writers, Glaude uses history to illuminate the present. As he remarks, the history that we tell ourselves is a key battleground for the country's future. This battle is currently being fought over public monuments, like the statue of Robert E. Lee that was recently removed from Richmond, Virginia, the heart of the Confederacy. Glaude reminds us that the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, in which Heather Heyer was killed by a rampaging car, was incited by a petition to remove a similar statue of this hero of the Confederacy. The Declaration of Independence is a stirring document that can still bring listeners to tears when read at 4th of July celebrations. Yet, as we know, our Constitution enshrines slavery by declaring the slave not a citizen, not a human being, but 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in Congress. This was one of the first and most fundamental instances of what James Baldwin called the lie. Glaude quotes from a Baldwin essay entitled The White Problem. The people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed. That lie is the basis of our present trouble. It is worth noting that the practice of slavery in this country was one of the most brutal, if not the most brutal, in history. While Southern slave owners were fond of invoking references to slavery in the Bible to justify their practice, slaves in Roman times had rights that were legally protected. The lie that the slave was not human underlies not only the particular brutality of American slavery, but the difficulty that Baldwin points out in our being honest about our history and our identity. For me, it underscores why it is so difficult to engage this country in the healing process of reparations. For as Glaude so eloquently points out, it means telling ourselves a different history. He writes, "For white people in this country, America, the land of the free, is an identity worth protecting at any cost." Instead of honest acknowledgement of our past and its grip on the present, we engage in what Glaude calls historical gaslighting, feel-good rituals like Martin Luther King Day. Baldwin and Glaude call white people to begin again, to discard the comfort of the lie, to fully confront, acknowledge, and feel the reality of dehumanizing a human being. That is terrifying because it fundamentally challenges our own humanity. Harriet Beecher Stowe called 19th century Americans to look unflinchingly at that reality. The original subtitle of Uncle Tom's Cabin was "The Man Who Was a Thing." Simon Legree tried to break Tom, to reduce him to an extension of his master's will, but Tom could not be broken. Stowe entitles the chapter in which Legree kills Tom "The Victory," to signify that Tom retained his essential self, his humanity. The emotional impact of Stowe's vivid Black characters and unflinching descriptions of the brutality of enslavement made the lie at the heart of American slavery untenable. White mothers and fathers who read Stowe's descriptions of Eliza saving her child in a perilous crossing of the Ohio River remembered their own children, some of whom had died, as infant mortality was high in the period before childhood diseases were under control. When the novel was put on stage, there was not one dry eye when Eliza reached the other side of the river. Stowe knew that if she could elicit this response, she did not need to make arguments against slavery. She had already succeeded in getting white people to see the subjectivity of enslaved Black people. For his cogent repurposing of Baldwin for our times, for his calling us to confront the trauma of the lie, not only for Black people, but for white perpetuators of it, and for our identity as a nation, it is an honor to present Dr. Eddie S. Glaude, Jr., the 2021 Stowe Prize.
It's my distinct honor on behalf of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center to give to you the 2021 Harriet Beecher Stowe Prize for your book, Begin Again. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. That's amazing.
Good evening. Wow, what a powerful and innovative evening and program. Thank you so much to the panel and the presenters. I'm Dave Jenkins, Chair of the Board at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. I want to give my heartfelt thanks to all of those who made this evening very successful. First, I want to thank Duana and Kathy, co-chairs of the Stowe Prize Committee, for their very, very hard work. They've worked months on this, and that work has obviously paid off. Thank you to our sponsors and generous supporters. Without your financial donation, we literally couldn't make this evening possible. So I want to thank you for that support. And want to also thank our presenters, of course, Jeffrey Ogbar, one of my fellow trustees. So thank you so much, Jeffrey. And Beth Burgess, Director of Collections here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. So thank you. And then lastly, Dr. Glaude, thank you so much for the work that you do. It's very, very meaningful. Thank you for coming to Hartford to have this very important discussion. We look forward to following your work in the future with much anticipation. And finally, thanks to those of you that are dialing in. We wish we could do this in person, but thank you for dialing in, whether you're in the neighborhood here or around the world. We thank you so much. Hopefully you walk away with something that you've learned and the courage to have great conversations about this very topic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This has been an amazing evening. Continue to support the Stowe Center. We ask that you would help us to continue to create these great programs. We congratulate again Dr. Glaude. We ask that if you can, please support, whether it's $50 or $5,000. We ask that you give and give generously. You can see on your screen the Give to Text platform, or you can link to our Stowe Center donation link. But we ask that you would give and have a great night. Thank you.